In this video, I am going to show you how I built this herringbone pattern king size headboard. For this build, I used white oak and a couple of 4x8 sheets of maple plywood. The build is simple, but it's time consuming. I also added some LED lights to the headboard. I started the build by milling rough sawn white oak lumber. I'm surfacing only 3 sides because the lumber is in different widths and I don't want to lose a lot of material surfacing on all 4 sides. I used jointer to flatten one face and square up one edge and used planer to make the second face flat to get the desired thickness. After surfacing the 3 sides, I'm using table saw to cut thin ribs. For cutting thin ribs, I changed to ripping blade. I'm ripping little over 1/4 of an inch and using a planer to get an even thickness and remove any table saw marks or burns. For the headboard, I'm using a 4x8 sheet of maple plywood. I measured and marked lines to get center of the plywood so that I know the starting point to glue the white oak thin ribs in herringbone pattern. I used a drywall square to mark the lines. For the longer side, I took my time to align lines from both ends. End-to-end lines should be straight to avoid any wrong alignment of thin strips. I used a board to clamp to the center line. Having the board clamped makes it easy because I can place the thin rib to the edge of the center board and glue and nail rather than eyeballing the center line. For cutting a 45-degree angle, I used a miter saw to cut the first angle and referred the piece to the plywood sheet to mark the end and used a table saw sled angled at 45 degrees to cut the other side. I used the first strip to draw a reference line on the plywood. This line will help in gluing the first piece and other pieces will follow the first one. I followed this process to cut all strips that are needed for the headboard in 45-degree angle. I referenced the strip to plywood to reduce the wastage before the second cut. After cutting thin ribs, I have added a small roundover to the strip to give some detail and visual appeal. The one in the left is without the roundover and one in the right is with roundover. I numbered all the thin ribs so it would be easy to identify the sequence when gluing and nailing them to the plywood. Also, it helps to route a small roundover because I need to route only the side that will be facing up and the thin ribs which will be facing up are numbered. Gluing the first thin rib to plywood needs to be accurate because it defines the direction the rest of the pieces will be glued. I took my time to align the first thin rib to the center of the lines at 45-degree angle. Then I drew a line at the end to help with the glue up. I added some glue in between the lines and carefully rolled the glue over before placing and nailing the first thin rib. To finish the rest of the glue up, I only glued 5 or 6 thin ribs at a time. This gives me time to carefully align and nail to the plywood before the glue dries out. After placing the thin ribs, I drew a line at the end and applied glue before nailing it to the plywood. I followed the same process to finish both sides at this end. After finishing the glue up on both sides of one end of the plywood, I carefully aligned the first thin rib and referenced the angle on the other side. I added few more thin ribs to double check the angle for the rest of the pieces. Once the angles are matched, I drew a line at the end and glued and nailed the thin rib. I followed the same process for the other side as well. This process takes time and being patient is the key to avoiding any mistakes. For gluing the rest, I followed the same process as before. After finishing all 4 sides, I added couple of thin ribs to the center and used a combination square to check the straightness before gluing and nailing. I'm adding 4 thin ribs at each end at a 90-degree angle with a 45-degree angle on the top to match the herringbone pattern. I added a few more strips at a 45-degree angle. These thin ribs will be in the center of the main herringbone pattern and the 90-degree pattern thin ribs. I used this design to give some visual appeal. I used the sharp edge of the glue brush to clean up any glue squeeze out between thin ribs. I followed the same process on the other side as well. To finish, I added a few more thin ribs at a 90-degree angle with a 45-degree angle on the top. I glued and nailed the thin ribs to plywood. I used a track saw to cut all the excess thin ribs on 4 sides. I just eyeballed and clamped the track, that way I don't cut into the plywood. Then I flipped over the headboard to do the final cut on all 4 sides to get a clean edge. For this cut, I referred the plywood corners and clamped the track before ripping the edges with the track saw. After the cut, I flipped the board over again, and you can see I used a blue tape to prevent any tear out from the track saw cuts. I bought another 4x8 sheet of maple plywood. I'm using this plywood to support the back of the headboard to avoid any sagging. I used a track saw and a table saw to cut the plywood into strips. One of the strips is cut in 45-degree angle for French cleat to install the headboard. I used glue and clamps to join the strips to the headboard, and for the French cleat I added screws to make it more secure. I placed the strip at the end of the headboard and drew a line. This line will help me to apply the glue without any spread out. I used clamps to secure the strips to the headboard. If you are still watching the video after 7 minutes, and if you like this build, please consider subscribing and support my channel. I let the glue sit for a couple of hours before taking out the clamps. I used a flush trim bit to remove any excess from the strips. This step is important because when gluing and nailing the edge trim, the headboard and the strips should be even. I screwed 1.5 inch screws to the French cleat for some added support. I drew a line to the center of the French cleat and used a punch tool to create a recess and drilled pilot holes before driving in the screws. For more stability, I added a couple more support strips in the center. I used a combination of pocket hole screws and 1.5 inch regular screws to secure the support strip. To cover the plywood edges, I am using solid white oak wood trim. For wood trim, I am ripping thin strips on the table saw and used a planer to get desired thickness and remove any table saw marks or burns. To attach the wood trim to plywood edges, I am using a combination of glue and pin nails. For attaching the wood trim to the long side of the headboard, I am using 2 pieces because the wood trim I surfaced is not that long and I want to use the material I have in hand. I also used blue painter's tape to secure the wood strip to the plywood edge. The blue tape will hold the trim so I can align and pin nail the trim to the edge. I repeated this process on all 4 sides. I let the glue dry for a couple of hours and then used a hand plane to remove the excess material. I am using a hand plane instead of router to remove the bulk of excess material to be on the safe side. I can use the flush trim bit on the router, but I had a bad experience a couple of times where the wood trim got chipped and I had to put some time into repairing the broken trim. After removing the bulk of excess material, I used a flush trim bit on the router to remove the leftover trim. I repeated the same process on the other side as well. To fill the gaps between the edge trim and headboard, I used a white oak water-based wood filler from Good Filler. This wood filler is easy to spread and will not sink, crack or fall out. Wood filler also has wood fillers in almost every wood species. And the best part is it's non-toxic and smells really good. After letting it dry, I sanded the whole headboard starting with 100 grit and finished at 180 grit. For the finish, I used hard wax oil. My choice is Rubio Monocoat in cotton white. I really like the look of cotton white on white oak. I applied small quantities and used a white pad and random orbital sander to apply the finish, and then used a Ryobi buffer to buff the finish and used a blue shop towel to remove any excess. I applied only one coat and did not use any Rubio maintenance oil. I really like the way this headboard turned out, and the cotton white finish complements the flooring in the home. The headboard is heavy and I used help of my cousin to mount the headboard. I appreciate you watching the video till the end. Please let me know your comments on the build. Any positive or negative feedback is appreciated. Your feedback will help me in improvising. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.